Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Today we continue with our two-part series on international students and welcome Dr. Shaun Carver, Executive Director of UC Berkeley's International House. A dual citizen of the UK and the US himself, Shaun previously was the Executive Director of the Hult International Business School, where he oversaw 750 students representing 82 countries. With international students in this country rising at the fastest rate in 40-plus years, it's more important than ever to make them feel welcome on college campuses, especially since international students are a key part of our economy. Last year, they created over 55,000 jobs in California. Shaun joins me today to talk about how higher education institutions can foster intercultural respect and understanding and create a more comfortable environment for international students that helps their enrollment and retention. Shaun, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Drum. Pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure to have you here. You are quite the expert when it comes to international students. One of the things that is becoming more and more critical as we hit the demographic cliff and we have far less traditional age students ready for college or going to college. So if you wouldn't mind, give our listeners a little bit of a background on how you got to be the head of International House there at UC Berkeley.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. My background, my mom is British, my dad is American. And so although most people would see those are very similar cultures, growing up in that household, there were definitely some distinct differences. And at an early age, became aware of things are done differently elsewhere. We moved around a lot when I was growing up, including living overseas. And I think it just instilled me with this sense of seeing that there's different people out there and that the way I see things isn't the way that other people see things. And so
really?
I kind of
You're kidding.
Yeah, I've had that since it's hard to believe not everyone agrees with me, but it's a big, beautiful world with a lot of different views and opinions. And it's really wonderful when you get out and experience those things. Mm-hmm. I got into my higher ed world as almost a second career. After I finished my MBA, I was given a opportunity to go teach in Beijing in a dual degree program. And this was working with Chinese learners that were in this Chinese system doing an undergraduate degree as well as a U.S. degree program, doing a typical undergrad degree that we would see here. And then I became really aware of different styles of learning, the different views on education. And being an expat in a foreign country really gave me that experience of what a lot of our international students feel when they come here to the U.S. And so I ended up, that one-year contract turned into 13 years in China, all in higher education and in international dual degree programs or joint university programs and things like that. I got into an executive director position and dean at Hult International Business School at their Shanghai campus. And there we enrolled in the MBA program. I think there was about 100, and all the degree programs, probably close to 250 students, all non-Chinese. So we had about 75 or different nationalities all living in Shanghai doing an international degree program, which was fascinating, and seeing how all of these people from around the world could come together and see the magic that kind of happens from that. You could see really, really strong relationships form with these folks who still stay together today. Mm-hmm. After my period at Hult, I went to UC San Diego, where I was an assistant dean of their graduate programs. And again, dealing with some of those programs are, 80, 90% international students when you look at Masters of Finance or accounting programs. And then the opportunity came to move up to International House, which brought all of this together. What we do here at International House is we are a living and learning facility. We bring about 620 scholars, undergrads, postgrads, PhD students, visiting faculty from the US and internationally to come live and work and study together. And so we have about 80 different nationalities in that group of 600. We have diversity in any way that you measure diversity, whether it's the color of your passport, economic diversity. So we do about $1 million of scholarships to help get economic diversity in the house. We do admissions across different degree programs to make sure there's a diversity in academic area and study. So we try to create this really complicated house, and the magic that happens within this community is really, really special. And that's how I got here.
Yeah. Well, I understand that international perspective. When you and I spoke the other day, I don't think I mentioned it, but I have actually lived outside the country for 18, 19 years. I grew up down in Panama and then lived in Europe and the Far East. And I've traveled extensively. So I jokingly tell people I look American, but I'm not.
It really changes your perspective when you get outside the US and look from the outside in, and you're surrounded by people who are asking questions because they're not from this country. They don't understand how some of these things work. And so it's really changes your perspective. It certainly did so for me. And although International House, we have about 20% are domestic students, in a lot of ways, the exposure they get here at iHouse is something they don't get. There's a lot of, I think we assume everyone travels, but it's not the case. A lot of Americans, especially in this age, don't even own a passport. So getting them in an environment where they can meet people from around the world and have conversations and make friendships with people that have completely different perspectives, different cultures, different understandings of value systems and things. It's just as beneficial to our domestic students as it is to our international students.
Absolutely. And that old saying, until you've walked a mile in somebody else's moccasins, you don't really understand them. What you're doing is you're providing these domestic students and the international students this cross-cultural pollination, which is so critical in today's world.
Well, and like you had mentioned, your time in Panama, when you're an expat, when you get off the plane and you're in another country that speaks a different language and does things differently, it really gives you the experience of our international students when they come here. And little things. I remember going to China, and the first thing was like, well, how do I get a cell phone? And how do I get a phone number? And how do I get connected to the internet? How do I get a bank account and an ATM card? Like, I needed someone to handhold me throughout that whole process, especially with limited language ability. Our international students come with a certain level of English that's much better than my Chinese ever was. But it's still a challenge. That experience, probably you had it and I did as well, it makes you a little bit more empathize with international students and the support they need when they get here.
Oh, absolutely. Because as you and I know, these international students face significant challenges and they need special levels of support that, well, we're starting to see that with more first-gen students and low SES students coming into colleges and universities. But the international students take it at a whole nother level because they're not acculturized into the U.S. way of doing things.
Yeah, and what is the U.S. way of doing things nowadays? There's so many, so many things in our world or in our society are open for debate and discussion, hopefully.
Yeah, good point.
And I think that's, you talk about the support for international students. I think it starts before they even apply. These international students, this is a huge commitment, not just financially, but also to, come out of a support system, a culture where you feel comfortable with, and to come halfway around the world to land at our universities. This is a major decision for them that they spend years preparing for, not just academically, but linguistically and taking all of the tests and getting the money prepared to come over, getting the visa, all of that. It's a major ordeal, and they do a lot of research because of that big investment that they're making. And it's important that our universities are seen as welcoming places, something I think has probably been damaged over the last 12, 18 months. If you're an outsider in a different country looking at U.S. universities right now, not all of them probably come across as welcoming to international students, especially those that may have a different opinion of some of the voices that have been on campuses lately.
Mm-hmm. And without getting into the politics too much, our son, he for many years has gone overseas to teach English as a second language. And his last gig was over in Taiwan. And there was a student over there who was preparing to come to the U.S. with his family. And he would be going to high school. And, the language school skills were really impressive, but the cultural aspects were a little challenging. And this is some of the things that you've had to deal with at International House.
Yeah, I think that was part of my experience and something that opened my eyes when I was in China is we would have in these dual degree programs, they'd be going into a Chinese university classroom, which was a lot more rote learning. It's memorization, recitation, a kind of learning environment. And then we were trying to bring in a US teaching environment where it's critical thinking, class participation, there's no right answer, have a point of view and be able to defend it. And for folks coming out of a different educational background, those skills don't come naturally. And so it was really interesting for me to see that this perception we have of, Asian students sit in the back, they're quiet, they don't talk. It's not that they're bad students. It's just that that's how you become a successful student in their culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so a big part of what we were trying to do, and I had actually started a school when I was over in China that we ran for about 7 years, that were preparing Chinese students to adapt to Western, US, UK, Canada, Australia teaching environments, which is getting more into critical thinking, not looking for what the right answer is, but reading and forming your own opinion. And that's a lot of stuff that people take for granted. When we enroll international students, we just think they're all the same, bring them in and they'll be fine. But there's a lot of challenges culturally that they face coming into these classroom environments.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about International House. What's the background? What makes it unique?
The whole International House movement started in 1908. A man who just graduated from university was working at the YMCA that was affiliated with Columbia University at the time. And as a mid-20-some-old walking down the steps of the Columbia Library one fall morning, he passed a student and in passing just said good morning. And the student stopped and kind of gave him a look and sparked a conversation. And the student said, "I've been in New York for 3 weeks and you're the first person to talk to me." And that interaction really touched Harry when he went home and talked to his wife, Florence Edmonds. This is 1908. Coming from China to New York was not just a 16-hour flight into JFK and you're good to go. This was probably a very, very long boat ride, train ride. This was an ordeal just to get to New York. Plus the isolation of being pushed out into housing that was not in the best areas and not being accepted by society, not even recognized as you're walking down the street. What a challenging situation for a lot of these international scholars. And shame on us for not being better hosts and taking advantage of learning about all these different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So Harry and Florence decided to invite international students into their apartment, modest apartment, for what they called Sunday suppers. And they would sit around the table, they would break bread and have a meal and learn about each other's cultures. They'd have these, interesting conversations about art or history or food, music, politics with folks from around the world. And this community started to develop out of the Edmonds apartment that eventually John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the Cleveland Dodge family got behind, and they built the first International House, which exists today adjacent to Columbia University. It was such a success that a couple years later, in 1930, they came here to Berkeley and opened up iHouse Berkeley, which is what I run here. Shortly after, there's an iHouse at University of Chicago. And then the Depression hit. So the Rockefeller houses ended after those first three. But that's what we do. We bring international and domestic students together under this idea that listening and learning and understanding different people, different perspectives is the way to solve problems and to make the world a more peaceful place. And we've been doing that since 1930.
Wow. Well, there's many challenges that institutions have to overcome when they start enrolling large numbers of international students. iHouse is one solution, but you mentioned earlier in the conversation, it really starts with the enrollment process. Could you take us through some of those challenges and how to deal with them?
Yeah, I think first, I have to acknowledge that a lot of universities are increasing international students because they pay some 2 or 3 times more than a domestic student would. And as state governments are cutting budgets of state universities, or there's pressures on private universities, that increasing enrollment of international students is a way to help the bottom line. I think the challenge is that there's a responsibility to provide services and support for international students. It's not just bring them in and get this additional surplus of revenue, but using that revenue to support housing, which is always a big issue for international students. And most universities don't have enough housing for their undergrads to start with, let alone ones that are specifically for international students.
Mm-hmm. This kind of strikes me a little bit about how the quote traditional demographic, high school graduates, et cetera, is changing, and they're going to more first generation students, low SES. There needs to be supports there. Is it similar, or is the international students that much more challenging because of the language barriers?
I think when you look at the diversity of what makes it what a college student is, whether they're first gen or whether they're international, there's no blanket approach to solve all of these things. I think there's a lot of things that are in common with first gen or transfer students versus international students, which is they're a lot of times coming into a university that they don't have the knowledge of how universities work and how to be successful and where are the pitfalls. They're not comfortable always going towards the resources that are available on campus. And the culture in the community has to be welcoming of folks who are uncomfortable or need more support. And that's not always the case, too. When you look at international students in particular, they have a lot of similarities with first gen or transfer students, which is they're not traditional in the US sense. And they face challenges and need more support to have successful outcomes.
Mm-hmm. I think what gets me is I've heard so many faculty at various institutions say the student need to come up to our level. And to some degree, they're right. But in other areas, they don't have the same background, the same structure that a quote traditional student does. Now, I am guessing from an academic perspective, international students may be better prepared. Is that a fair statement, or am I completely out to lunch? Well, don't say that. Don't say that.
First I would say any faculty that says, these students have to come up to our standard, I would challenge them to define what they mean by their standard. These students who get into their classroom meet all of the entry requirements. In some cases, for international students, the requirements are higher than for a domestic student. Mm-hmm. So what is the standard that you're asking? Because you let these students in. You need to talk to your admissions program and figure out, if these students aren't meeting your standard, define it and make sure that you're recruiting students in that meet those standards. Otherwise, you're setting them up for failure. Getting to your point, I think in a lot of ways, international students do have a lot more challenges than domestic students. Just look at the admissions process. I can't, my children are fairly young. I've got 5 years before we need to start doing university applications, and I'm on the business side of it as well. So, it's complicated. There's a lot of subtleties in what it takes to get in. Understanding the different cultures of universities. International students, like a lot of them, domestic students, they know the brand names. They know they know Stanford and Cal, but they can't tell you the cultural difference of those campuses. The difference between a private Ivy or a public university. They know the names. They'll list out the 20 aspirational universities they want to apply to, but they don't always understand, is this a good fit for me? They need to look beyond the name of the university and look at the strength of the program you're applying to. Mm-hmm. All those things are challenging for domestic students. Now, imagine if it was in a foreign language, and how would you navigate that? I always think if I was applying to a university in China or Germany or a place where I didn't really speak the language, how would I get information about those universities and these things that we're talking about? How difficult would the application process be if it was only in German or Chinese? There's a lot more challenges that international students go through. And we're not even touching on the financial aspect of it. Sure. Again, in some universities that I'm fairly familiar with, they're paying extra $30,000 a year above and beyond what a domestic student pays. And they're coming from countries that are not always developed, with high GDPs and folks with the means to pay $100,000 a year to go to a university. I've got students here who they come from countries where a doctor makes $1 a day. And so, once they get here, their whole life is at iHouse. We feed them, we give them great meals, we give them as much programming and entertainment and social life that they can get without asking them to pay for any of that stuff. It's all included in our room and board fees. Mm-hmm.
So how do you create this diverse environment that's supportive for your students?
Yeah, I think, because we've been doing this for 100 years. So, it's not like this is something new. When people apply to iHouse, and, iHouse, even though we're at UC Berkeley, International House is an independent 501c3. We're a nonprofit organization. We receive no funding from the university, no support from the university. We operate independently. So we've been doing this for a long time, and people apply here because they want to be part of this diverse community. They want to be exposed to different views. They want to be out of their comfort zone. When you look at how our demographics are made up, about 20% are domestic. And there's a lot of diversity within our domestic population. It's not like all of the US students agree or have the same view of the world or necessarily the same culture. And then the next group, we probably have China, which is about 9% of the house. So 50, 60 out of 600, followed by India, France. So, no matter where you're at iHouse, when you're sitting down, it's likely you're surrounded by a lot of people who are not like you. And you have to listen. To get along in this community, you have to be comfortable with being around other people with different views. And you have to be curious to want to ask questions and learn about it. Folks that come here because they just want a place to live that's close to campus, that has great food and a place, a library that's open 24 hours, they generally don't do well here because this isn't a good fit for them. If you don't want to be surrounded by different people, if you don't want to learn about the differences that we all have, if you don't want to have conversations with people who have different views than you, then iHouse isn't a great. But we fortunately get people who want to be part of this and really benefit from this experience here. I talked to alumni that around here in we say the golden years, which was right after World War II, when the world was trying to heal and come together. And I talked to alumni that were here for 1 year in like 1947, and they talk passionately about that 1 year they had at iHouse and the friends that they made that they still keep in touch with. And the experience they had being 2 years out of fighting with Germans and Japanese and sitting at iHouse at a table across from Germans and Japanese and being able to talk to them as peers and see them in a different way. That's the power of this community, which is a lot of these preconceived ideas of other folks. When they're part of your community and when you listen and learn and you don't other them and fear them, but you want to understand and build relationships, it's really, really powerful. People remember this experience for many, many, many decades. And that's special. There's not a lot of places that are that impactful on your life that you'll remember for 50, 60 years afterwards.
Oh, no doubt. Now, what's your special sauce? How is it that you're able to do this? You've done it for over 100 years. Are there specific things that you look for in admitting people to iHouse? Are there certain processes that you put in place to make sure that people share their diverse views, etc.?
Yeah, that's an area I'm always kind of interested in. When I did my doctorate, I did research and looked at our alumni and what were the things that they felt were most impactful. Right now, we're working with one of our alumni who's a researcher and trying to look at how do we identify people that fit this experience. But there's the other side of it, which is, in some ways, it's the people who don't know they need this that need it the most. And, the people that think, I'm just going to go to iHouse. And we get this every year. There's always a percentage of people that get in. Because if you look at your admissions, yes, we have essays and you have to write an essay and everything. I can tell you at Berkeley, these kids know how to write an essay. They know how to write an answer that you want to hear. And then you throw in ChatGPT and it's just how reliable are those as predictors of... So, we're really looking at how do we do admissions and how do we identify folks that will get the most out of this experience. So it is a challenge. But as I mentioned, we get folks who come in not knowing much about iHouse. They just know our location is directly across the street from campus and it's on the top of the hill and it's great view and beautiful old building. And that's why they apply. And then as we do our orientation and things, I do my whole history of iHouse and our whole reason for being. And I get people coming up like, I had no idea, but this is great. And I'm really looking forward to this experience. And that's important for us to be successful is that people see that. Mm-hmm. Like I said, if you come in with a closed mind, with blinders on and intellectually arrogant to the point where I know what right is and I don't want to be talking to anyone who thinks otherwise and they're all wrong, I'm right. This is a tough environment to be in. But I think ultimately with universities, our role is to help expand people, to challenge people, to get them to see different perspectives, critical thinkers.
Yeah. So you've got an enrollment or really an admissions policy. You've got a process that people have to go through. How do you set up different structures at iHouse to make sure that people come together, or do you?
Yeah, well, first, just create so much diversity that there's no dominant group. Like I said, our biggest group is domestic. That's 20%. So any domestic student, there's 4 other people from around the world for every one domestic person. And then when we do admissions, we really try to create a very complicated house. Like I said, it's not just, we have 75 different nationalities in the house this year. It's like we have 75 different nationalities. We have 20% that are getting some sort of financial aid because they're not the world's richest kids. They're the people who got in by merit and need support to be here and bring a unique perspective. We admit so that we don't have a dominant area of study. It's not all engineering students or business students or law students. If you're the one student at Berkeley studying Sanskrit, I want you here in my house. I want that perspective. I want your view of the world, and I want you sharing that knowledge with people who are not get exposure to it any other time. And so, we really try to create a lot of complications in our admissions process. And that just creates this environment where no one's in a dominant position. And so everyone's a bit vulnerable, everyone's a bit uncomfortable, and everyone's really curious. And it creates this really great vibe. We do things like our undergrads have to share a room, double up in a room. But you can't double up with someone who's from your country, which creates a whole nother, it's a lot easier to live with someone from your country than it is to live with someone from a different country that you're not familiar with. We're not totally mean. It is a thoughtful, uncomfortable experience for a purpose. But if you want to do a room change, you can, but it's only after 2 weeks. And usually, after the first 2 nights, someone's in here, I got to change rooms. My roommate, I can't live with it. And then after 2 weeks, they settle down and they were like, oh, this is a really nice person. And it works out.
Yeah.
So, we create these environments that hopefully puts them out of their comfort zone a little bit and helps them grow.
Oh, I get that. At the Naval Academy, obviously, we were assigned roommates, and my 2 roommates, one was from Peru, the other was from Ecuador. They both spoke Spanish, but they couldn't understand each other because they were different dialects.
Did you have to interpret? Did you have to be in the middle? And
I did not even try. They figured it out, just like your roommates do.
Yeah, I think it's natural. And when I went to China, I certainly did this. And so I do as I say, not as I do. But when I went to China, I immediately looked for expats, other Americans, and go find this bubble to kind of isolate myself in. And, is comforting and makes life easier. I don't feel like I got as much out of my experience because of that decision to not immerse myself in a different culture, in a different language, which would have been, very challenging, but it would have changed my experience dramatically if I had done that. Mm-hmm. And so, we try to create that here. I mean, obviously, look, it's stressful enough to be a Berkeley student and the work that you got to do just to get your degree. We don't want to make life miserable, and we don't, but we want them to feel challenged here and to step out of their comfort zone and feel good about that. And generally, pretty quickly, they realize that it's not that hard. And people are people, and they're really nice, even though they're different culture, but they're my friend, and they're someone I have dinner with. And these relationships, as I've seen, will last for decades.
Yeah. Well, they have a shared experience. They're all going to Berkeley. And Berkeley being as challenging as it is, there is a common touch point. It's no longer nationality. It's you're a student at an incredible university. And this will bring people together.
Yeah, I see these students. We call them residents because for iHouse, there are residents, but for the university, they're students. And I see, our residents is really having 3 different affiliations at this period. They're a Cal alumni, an alumni of the University of California and all the things that go along with that. They're alumni of the engineering school or the environmental science school, and they're alumni of iHouse. And what we see over time is that because the relationships we form here at iHouse are very emotional. It's not transactional, which is I paid a tuition, I did the work, you gave me a diploma. This is I made friendships that changed my life. I had experiences here that I still hold dear to my heart right now. And so when we talk to our alumni, even though they're Cal alumni or the law school or business school alumni, they hold on very strong to their affiliation with iHouse. This isn't a dorm. How many people would donate money back to their dorm? Our alumni are 100,000 alumni of iHouse Berkeley, which we have 7 Nobel Prize winners and heads of state and governors of California, heads of business, people who have leadership roles in the United Nations. I mean, our alumni is incredible. They give back to iHouse because it's not a dorm. This is about this experience that they have here. But then that's the special sauce is it's an emotional connection. And it's something that what they have here, they carry on and apply throughout their life. And that's a dream for us. As a mission-based organization, we want to teach them that, this diversity and learning about different cultures and different perspectives and trying to find common solutions, That's what we try to teach here. And then we hope they go out and change the world. And fortunately, it seems to do very well.
Well, as I learned years ago, you change the world one person at a time, and that's what you're doing.
100%. We graduate about 600 a year, and it's a big world. So, I'm always thinking, how do we graduate 6,000 or 60,000 a year that go off and have an impact? If we really want to change the world, it doesn't happen 600 at a time. It happens with a big movement. And I hope the iHouse movement continues to grow and spread out there in the world.
Well, I'm sure it will. Shaun, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. As we typically do, our two final questions. 3 takeaways for higher ed presidents and boards.
Yeah, difficult positions to be in right now. So I'm sure a lot of people are looking for advice. And, I think if I was to say 3 takeaways, 1, lead with your values and your culture. Universities need to be confident and be intentional with what the values of the university is and what the culture within the universities are. Everyone should know what those principles are that you stand for, whether it's faculty or new students or alumni or donors and supporters and friends in the community. Everyone should know what the values and principles of the university are and what they stand for. And I don't think be apologetic about that. I think second, be consistent with policies. I think if you start wavering on policies, then you can be seen as favoring one side versus another, which tends to feel too political and inconsistent. And I think inconsistency in policies leads to a lack of institutional confidence. People don't think you know what you're doing if you're flip-flopping or have different standards for different groups. So I think be consistent. And the last thing I think most important, and certainly critical for us here at iHouse, is giving people the freedom to express their beliefs. There's a big difference between education and indoctrination. And I think in universities, our role is to teach folks to listen, to learn, to question, to challenge ideas, and to think critically. If our goal is to teach them to accept certain beliefs unconditionally, there's no critical thinking. We're indoctrinating kids. And I don't think that's what our role as universities is. Our role is to teach them to think critically. And you can't do that if you're not willing to listen to folks who are different than you. If you're not willing to listen, try to understand, not agree. That's not the goal here, is to get everyone to agree with each other. The goal is to get everyone to listen to each other, try to understand each other, and try to find ways to move forward that includes everybody. That's a big challenge on campuses right now, is that the culture in classrooms and out of classrooms is not everyone feels comfortable to express their beliefs. And higher ed is not about that. We're not the university teaching the flat earth, right? And everyone has to believe that the earth is flat. You got to have someone come in and say, no, the world's round, and here's why I think the world's round. We need Aristotle in there, and we need civility in those environments so that we don't immediately listen to what someone says or look at them and say, I know what you're thinking, and I don't believe in it, and I want to shut you down, and you shouldn't be able to talk. We need civility. Let's just respect that other people have different views. Let's have a conversation. Let's try to understand it, and let's move forward together.
That makes so much sense, especially when it comes to the globalization, which in many circles is a negative term, but it really has to do with you're no more than an airplane flight away from all the rest of the countries in the globe. We need to understand them and work together. What's next for you? What's next for iHouse?
Currently, I'd like to see iHouse have even a more prominent role on the UC Berkeley campus in bringing our communities together, because of the things we just discussed. I think iHouse can be a place that we have the power to convene. We've been doing this a lot longer than any of the issues we're dealing with today. We've been here since 1930, and iHouse as a movement started before World War I. We've been through global conflict, and we've held steady with this idea of how we do things. And so I would like to see iHouse be a little bit more of a central player in UC Berkeley and how we bring different sides together and have conversations in civil ways and try to come together. As I mentioned, there's 3 other Rockefeller houses out there. There's other institutions that are iHouse institutions, not part of the Rockefeller first houses, but follow the movement. And I'd like to see those work more closely together and engage these passionate alumni, 100,000 alumni here that really are passionate about this experience. And I'd like to see them have more impact in the world and how they can support us in advancing our mission. So I think those are the 3 things, small things, just, go out and change the world, small goals that we're working on.
Well, those are great. Shaun, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to be on this show. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I look forward to the next time we get a chance to chat.
I did too. Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity, and I look forward to chatting with you again.
Likewise. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Dr. Shaun Carver, Executive Director of UC Berkeley's International House, and for his sharing with me what makes iHouse special and how it creates an environment that helps retain international students at our colleges and universities. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Dr. Shaun Carver, Executive Director of UC Berkeley's International House, and for his sharing with us what makes iHouse special and how it creates an environment that helps retain international students at our colleges and universities. Tune in next week when we welcome Tom Netting back to the show. Tom and I will be talking about the latest goings-on in Washington, including the status of the new Title IX regulations that dropped a while back and how they'll affect all higher ed institutions. Thanks again for listening. See you next episode.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.